afternoon, everyone. My name is Ari Kirshner, partner of McCabe Kirshner in Chicago, and I guess welcome following the ice cream social. IMEC has saved the best for last. As a matter of just a couple housekeeping matters, and before I introduce the panel, we are absolutely willing to entertain questions over the course of our presentation. Please don't hold them until the end. We welcome questions, we welcome heckling, we welcome flying objects as long as they're not sharp. So please don't wait until the end if there's something that comes up that you would like to ask any of the panelists about. All of the bios for our speakers today are found in the written and electronic materials, but going through them very quickly, to my immediate left is Peggy McCabe, partner at McCabe Kirshner in Chicago. She is a captives operation and formation guru. Next to her, Robert Humphreys, legal eagle on the Cayman Islands and an attorney at Solomon Harris. And finally, our actuarial wizard, Jeremy Brigham of Willis Towers Watson. Our objective today is really threefold. The first is to present to you and provide you some technical and substantive information with regards to the SPC PIC structure. In order to fully understand what it is that we've done, though, you have to understand the story behind it. So we're going to tell you a little bit of the genesis of how we got to today and the SPC PIC structure and relationship that we have amongst our various competitor nursing home organizations. And last but not least is obviously brass tacks. For anyone that's in a single parent captive or is already converted to an SPC, there's the issue of monetizing the PIC opportunities that present themselves today, and that's something that we're going to address at the very end. Like any good episode of This American Life, our presentation today comes to you in 3 acts. Act 1 will be Once Upon a Time, so Peggy McCabe will go through the history. Act 2 will be #legal stuff, where Robert Humphreys will go through the technical details of legal relationships between a PIC and its parent SPC. And finally, actuarial wizardry will conclude with Jeremy Brigham. Before we launch into the story, though, there are a story is not complete without its characters. So I need to introduce you just to 2 organizations and their respective captives. The first is the Symphony Post-Acute Network. It is a long-term care provider located in the Chicagoland area. Its associated or affiliated captive is Maple Leaf Insurance SPC. The second is Villa Healthcare, also located in the Chicago area, and its affiliated and associated captive is Centurion PIC. By way of just slight background knowledge, the 2 of them are fierce competitors in the marketplace within which they operate. So our story, Once Upon a Time, begins back in 2009, before PICs, before SPCs. Peggy, what was going on back then?
So in 2009, I was with the parent organization, the Symphony Post-Acute Network. We were operating in 3 states. And had assisted skilled facilities and some independent living facilities. So majorly kind of long-term care in general. What was happening within the company was the 9 skilled facilities in Chicago were driving 90% of the losses. At the time, the 9 facilities had deductibles already between $75,000 and $125,000. All the buildings were insured commercially under one program, but at varying deductible levels. As we rolled into our 2009 renewal, the 9 buildings in Chicago, those deductibles were going to go up. The remaining buildings in Illinois were going to have to assume some deductibles. And the buildings in the other states were pretty much staying flat. We did have a big presence in Arizona, but at the time, luckily, Arizona wasn't as bad as it is right now for long-term care. So the owners, when they saw our renewal proposal, were very risk averse. They were involved, had owned these buildings since the early 80s, so had been in the market a long time and had varying different insurance programs. And in fact, had a 5-year period where they were in a risk retention group that was not a good outcome for them. So they had a lot of fear about going into sort of another self-insurance program. So this was a very risk-averse portfolio of folks to try to get to move into some sort of self-insurance. But after looking at this and knowing at the time, and it still is, the working layer of coverage in Illinois is 150,000 and under. It's extremely high frequency, very low severity in that area. So after we looked at this, I pretty much said, we're going to be self-insured anyway because of the deductibles if we don't do something differently. So at that point in time, we decided to start a single parent captive, and that was Maple Leaf Insurance. Started in 2009 with primarily PLGL. Primarily PLGL. Now, through the years, in 2010 and 2014, the parent did become much more comfortable with the self-insurance programs and put their workers' compensation as well as employee stop-loss into the captive. So as they moved along, they did become much more comfortable with the risk exposure. However, for our story today, we're going to focus on the PLGL because that's what drove us into the conversion to an SPC and starting a PIC, literally with one of our fiercest competitor in the market. So as we started this single parent captive, our big focus was on risk management. The parents were a very data-driven company. They wanted to see a lot of data on their losses because of the fact that we had essentially gotten pushed into a self-insurance situation. So we decided to take the claims handling and the risk management in-house. And this is a really important feature as we talk about going forward and how we got to actually starting a PIC and having the parent as well as the SPC be comfortable starting this PIC. So we have this very aggressive risk management platform in place that this is really based more for long-term care, but the point is, as you go into this relationship with an SPC and a PIC, and especially in our situation where the PIC is totally unrelated, there is no legal relationship between the participant in the PIC and the parent of the captive. So totally separate. The risk management plan that we had in place is now probably, number one of the most significant criteria for deciding if we're going to do a PIC for another outside company, meaning that their willingness and ability to conform to our risk management program is one of the criteria that we use to decide if we're going to start a PIC. Secondly, the ongoing monitoring from the SPC to the PIC. The risk management platform is one of the tools that we utilize to make sure that we don't have what we like to refer to as the rogue PIC. How does the SPC have some control over those PICs? And the risk management platform that's in place is one of those tools. Rob's going to talk a little bit about the board composition and some of the other things that you can do to make sure that you don't have that rogue PIC scenario happen where you have somebody doing something crazy in a PIC that, although they're separate legal entities, they're still piggybacking off of your license. So we have this risk management plan set up. We start to do some other creative things in-house. We hired our own in-house counsel. So as I mentioned before, we had 9 buildings in Cook County that were driving 90% of our loss costs. So we decided to defend those cases in-house and hire our own trial lawyers, which Ari was one of our first hires in-house. During this time period, the portfolio had actually doubled in size by 2010, including more Cook County presence. So the acquisition of the defense team really helped our captive. We were tracking our captive outside defense costs, and we were, in 2009, just over $2 million a year in outside defense costs, and we dropped it to $74,000 in outside defense costs in 2 years. So that was a big pickup for the captive, and it's one of the reasons that I believe wholeheartedly, we use the same actuary. We use Jeremy a lot on all of our PICs as well as the SPC because he's seen what we do internally and able to tweak some of the results in the forecasting for our new PICs and the new insureds when they come on board based on some of the things that we've already put in place. By 2014, this is sort of what we did with our Symphony portfolio. 2008, that's our last year with our commercial carrier. And this is premium and deductibles in all closed years. I do not believe any data at all unless the entire year is closed out, every last dollar paid, because it is never over till the fat lady sings. So this is where we stand in 2014. Between 2028 and 2014, the portfolio tripled. So we tripled the number of beds that were insured in that time period as well, including Cook County, which is still pretty bad to operate in litigation-wise. So the turning point comes in 2015. At this point in time, we're rolling along. We've got the captive. We are still experiencing huge litigation insurance issues in Cook County. At the time, we had formed what's called the Alliance of Healthcare Counsel. This is a group of in-house counsel as well as some outside counsel that get together. The council had three main initiatives. It was to discuss payer issues, which everybody in healthcare has had payer issues, and especially in our extremely fiscally responsible state of Illinois, we have had a lot of payer issues. The second focus was regulatory issues. Nursing homes are highly regulated, and everybody had regulatory issues. And the third was insurance and litigation. Insurance and litigation became the dominant question and focus for our meetings. And it was at this point that one of our, as Ari said, our fiercest competitors came to us and said, we are thinking of starting a single-parent captive. We're exploring that. However, they were, at the time, a more mid-sized portfolio of about 20 nursing homes in 3 states. They had 4 in Illinois, and those 4 were, again, driving 90% of their litigation costs. So as one of the alternatives, they came to us and said, we had talked about the portfolio insurance company, the new legislation here in Cayman, and would we be willing to start a PIC for them? Totally unrelated company, and as Ari said, the marketing folks, they've got buildings down the road and pretty fierce competitors. So we went back to our owners of the parent as well as the board of the captive and said we'd really like to do this. And we did have one link to them. One of the owners of this company, Villa Healthcare, was actually employed with us at Symphony for the majority of his career, and when he kind of was mentored to the point of being able to start his own nursing home company, went off and started his own company. So everybody had some relationship with them. All for profit. Yeah. Oh, geez.
Hold on, Bob. You're getting to my slides now.
Oh, geez.
Yes, we will get that. So, oh, yes.
And expense, both, yeah. The whole thing, yeah. So they came to us. We made the decision at that point, yes, we would help them and start a PIC. And so we knew the first thing we had to do was convert Maple Leaf to an SPC, and then we had to form a PIC.
Right, and so to that point, Rob, take us through this whole single-parent captive, SPC conversion, inclusion of PICs. What goes into it?
Yeah, thanks, Ari and Peggy. I'll try and sort of talk conceptually to the corporate legal framework for a bit, so just give you an idea and a concept of what an SPC is, a segregated portfolio company, and what a PIC is, and how they work together, from a corporate legal perspective, and then how Maple Leaf SPC eventually ended up using those entities in their risk management structure. So first of all, a little bit about origin of PICs. We start off with SPCs. That's Cayman Segregated Portfolio Companies. That's our version of a segregated cell company as it's known elsewhere in the world. Now, an SPC is an excellent vehicle. Peggy, can I grab the clicker?
Yep.
Thanks. So an SPC is an excellent vehicle, but it's not perfect in all respects. So, for example, a cell is not a separate legal entity, so it can't contract with other cells. So you can't risk pool or quota share, for example, between cells of an SPC. The SPC board also has to govern cells. So we've got a separate program in individual cells with separate participants. They don't have the independence of the board that they might want to have. And there's certain uncertainties as regards the tax status of an individual cell as opposed to an individual standalone company. So there was a need for a new legal vehicle in Cayman, and that's where the PIC came in, the portfolio insurance company known elsewhere as an incorporated cell company. Some traction started taking off for incorporated cell companies in places like Vermont, concepts in Jersey and Guernsey around the time. And in the beginning of 2015, Cayman finally introduced an amendment to the insurance law and the insurance portfolio insurance company regulations, which introduced the possibility of having a portfolio insurance company in Cayman. What I want to do is just skip ahead to the next slide, just so you can sort of visualize what these look like, conceptually. Let's spend just a little bit of time looking, first of all, at a conventional SPC with two cells under it. So it's a segregated portfolio company. If we imagine this as a sponsored cell captive, we would see that SPC being the licensee. And we can see that we've got two cells underneath it, cell 1 and cell 2. And because you have, in an SPC, statutory separation and segregation of assets and liabilities between the component cells of the SPC, you're able to house separate insurance programs in each of those cells. So as a sort of a sponsored cell captive, if you like, you might see that there's an insurance program number 1 in cell 1 and an insurance program number 2 in cell 2. And underneath that, you'll see the participants of those programs. Those participants are the underlying insureds. Traditionally, they would be your captive owners in a single-parent sort of captive scenario. So the program is housed in the cell. The cell then issues participating shares, usually non-voting participating shares, to the participants. The program is run in the cells, and the participants are allowed to participate economically through their equity shareholding in those cells. I mentioned the statutory segregation of assets and liabilities in those cells. But remember, that whole SPC structure is one single legal entity all by itself. So cell 1 is not a separate legal entity to cell 2, and cell 1 and cell 2 are not separate legal entities to the core of the SPC. That means they can't contract with each other. Legally, you've got to have two separate entities or persons to contract together. And as an SPC, you can't do that. So you can't quota share or risk pool between cell 1 and cell 2.
And Rob, so just for clarification, so one is able to establish an SPC in an underlying cell, but that underlying cell is not a PIC.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So we make the distinction, we say, a PIC or portfolio insurance company is an incorporated cell company. An SPC or cell company is not incorporated. Those cells are unincorporated parts of the greater SPC, if you like, with a legal segregation of assets and liabilities within them. So if we skip ahead, so that's your sort of conventional SPC structure with two cells, and just conceptually to have a look at what a PIC looks like. So this is an SPC with a single cell and a single PIC. Now, if we're looking at that again in a sort of a sponsored captive insurance situation, you'd have that SPC as the licensee. Cell number 1 underneath the SPC would have been created solely for the purpose of holding the ordinary shares in an underlying PIC. And the reason that you need to have cell 1 holding those ordinary shares is because the way the legislation is drafted, if the PIC is to piggyback off the license of the SPC has to remain as the controlling relevant insurer. And in order to do that, there's got to be ownership of the voting shares in the PIC by the SPC, so that ultimately the SPC, as the primary licensee, has sort of ultimate control over the board of the PIC, which is actually set up as a completely separate company. So that PIC in blue underneath is a separate portfolio insurance company. It's a separate legal entity altogether. Although its controlling voting shares are held by the overlying SPC. And just like a single parent captive, we would see the insurance program being housed in that PIC, and we would see the insureds, or the participants in black below there, participating in that PIC via an equity interest, whereby they can then participate in the insurance program and the economic benefits of it, so underwriting and investment incomes, as well, of course, as managing their own risk management needs. So just conceptually, that's what it looks like in your head. I'm now going to flip ahead. Yes, sir.
So what's the point of that?
Well, what is the point of? Because a PIC has some, and we'll get to it shortly in the next few slides, there's some significant differences between what a PIC can do and what cells of an SPC can do, primarily because a PIC is a completely separate legal entity, whereas cells of an SPC are not, so they can't.
I got that. So
This is just an example to help.
do one for one, right?
Yes.
You just make them captive, right?
Well,
This only makes sense if you're going to have two cells or three cells.
No, there can be reasons to do it separately. In fact, we'll see it in the Maple Leaf example when we're coming up, because with Maple Leaf, at the end, you'll see another diagram where we have two insurance programs. One of them is actually housed in the core of the SPC because it was converted from an exempted company, licensed insurance company, to an SPC for purposes of forming the PIC later. And for that reason, we have to house the one insurance program in the core, and we then create a PIC underneath a single SP, and we house the next insurance program in that PIC. And those are still housed, although it's under one licensee, they're still housed in legally separate entities. Yes, sir?
So the PIC obviously has its own board.
It does indeed.
Here is cell A or cell 1, excuse me. Is it insuring anything, or is it simply holding the voting shares?
Its only purpose in life is to hold the voting shares.
Does it have a separate board?
No, it does not. So because it's not a separate legal entity, so it's a cell of an SPC.
Okay, so the SPC has a board.
Indeed, it does.
Correct.
The PIC is subject to the board of the SPC.
No, and that's where it gets interesting later on.
Distinct, what you said before, that the one still controls the other.
It does, and bear with me, we'll get to it shortly.
Talk about the capital here. If the PIC screws up and needs money, you can grab the capital from the SPC board.
No, there's no, because they're separate legal entities, there's absolutely no legal obligation for the overlying SPC to contribute further capital to the PIC. Of course, you could agree that contractually if there was a reason to do so, and usually there's not. So usually any agreements, legal agreements governing the framework, we would specifically exclude that as a possibility, so that the overlying SPC would never be responsible for further funding of the PIC, collateral, minimum capital requirements, whatever it may be.
Just to follow up on Bob's question, so you don't necessarily need multiple SPCs for this to make sense. You need to at least have multiple PICs. Right? You wouldn't set it up
Yes.
if at the end of the day all you're going to do is one PIC. Then you're back to a single parent captive, basically.
Well, there are some tremendous savings we experienced with the first PIC over some arrangements. So, for example, the fronting carrier now is fronting over everything. So the costs have decreased tremendously. As PIC number 2 comes on board, now the fronting costs are shared between 70 entities. All the administrative fees, we have cut the administrative budgets for everybody because there's these economies of scale with the vendors. So far, every one of our PICs have chosen the same vendors. So we're seeing tremendous savings. And now as they progress into other lines, such as employee stop loss, we're getting the same savings over putting them over multiple PICs, and we're now having a tremendous pool of employees and things like that as well, able to pull together.
And one thing I'll add, just for perhaps purposes of ambiguity, you are correct. You wouldn't set this structure up just to put all of the insurance business in the
In
PIC.
one PIC.
We're presuming that there's also an insurance business in the core as well. Yeah.
And ordinarily, the sort of structure that you might see is you'd have an SPC set up with a core, nothing in the core, and then a series of cells and a series of PICs underneath them. And the only reason with Maple Leaf SPC, as you'll see in some slides to come, that we've housed the insurance program in the core and another insurance program in the PIC beneath it is just because of the conversion that we had to do to get to the structure in the first place. So it's not a typical structure that you would see. I'm going to keep that diagram up on the screen and just run through some of the features of the PIC, which I know you were interested about. So some features of the PIC as opposed to a cell in an SPC. So a PIC does not require an insurance license itself. That's one of the major benefits from a cost perspective. It can piggyback off the insurance license of the overlying SPC. And again, that's one of the reasons why ultimately the SPC wants to have some control of the board at the end of the day, so that the underlying PIC board doesn't go rogue, if you like, and do anything that might jeopardize the license of the overlying SPC, which could have an impact on the program, of course, that's in the core, or programs that are being operated through other PICs or cells. So some of you will know you've usually got an insurer in the Cayman Islands has got to have a business plan. So in this situation, the SPC itself will have a business plan, but the PIC also needs to have its own separate business plan. There always needs to be a cell of the PIC's SPC, which is its controlling relevant insurer for purposes of the law. Again, that's the control criteria that we've just discussed. Similar to a standalone captive, there can't be an issue or transfer of voting shares without SEMA approval. And no issue or transfer of more than 10% of any other voting rights without SEMA approval. Importantly, there's express power for the PIC to contract with the core, any other cell in the structure, or the core of the SPC itself. And again, that allows for the risk pooling, quota sharing, or other intra-group contracting that would not have been possible if you were just using an SPC program with a series of cells underneath it. They're not their own separate legal entities. They can't contract with each other. Capital requirements. A cell does have to have its own capital requirements. MCR and PCR, so minimum capital requirement and prescribed capital requirement, are effectively the same as if the PIC was a standalone captive. But it's always subject to CIMA's discretion to either move that minimum capital requirement and prescribed capital requirement up or down depending on the circumstances. And unlike the insurance law, the PIC regulations actually allow CIMA to set a lower capital requirement if they think there's circumstances that would justify it. And in fact, we've just seen that moving a captive insurance company from Bermuda to Cayman under a PIC that's been created in an existing structure. The insurance program is in runoff, and there's really no need for the basic capitalization requirement. So $100,000 as a Class B1 captive would be the usual minimum capital requirement. We've managed to reduce that in those circumstances. That's an additional benefit.
And just to add in, that lower capital requirement is what makes this particular structure much more, again, if you're exploring the opportunity of expanding your SPC structure, an umbrella to allow for additional revenue sources, makes this structure much more attractive to outside third-party business as opposed to them going into their own single-parent captive or a rent-a-captive program. From the market research that we've done in the clients that we're working with, the capitalization requirements in this particular structure are the lowest available.
So just some other sort of final features. You cannot have more than one PIC per cell. So you set up a cell for the sole purpose usually of holding the voting shares in a PIC. You can't have 3 or 4 PICs under one cell. That doesn't work. You've got to set up a separate cell for each one. But practically that's not a problem, and there's no sort of significant cost implication to it. And a PIC can be formed under either a brand new cell or an existing cell of an SPC. So those are some... Yes, they'll be separate. So yes, a PIC has to have its own separate audit every year.
Why couldn't you sell that more than one PIC?
I don't know why the legislation was written that way, but that's how it's being written. I think because they want to make it clear that the actual cell that holds those shares will only be interested in that specific PIC with the specific insurance program that's written underneath it, and for that to be very clear. There's also sort of nefariously the observation that every time you set up an SP under an SPC structure, there's an extra fee that needs to be paid to the registrar of companies each year. But I'm sure the intentions of the legislators were pure when they drafted the legislation. So those are some of the features of the PICs. Now, more interestingly, some of the advantages. We've already talked about the intra-cell or intra-group contracting, which you couldn't do with an SPC. With a PIC, we also think we've had lots of discussions with our onshore, tax and legal counsel in the US. One of the topics that often comes up with SPC structures is, can an individual cell within that SPC structure make its own tax election? Usually, no, it can't. And if it was ever challenged in court, would it be upheld? Or would they be looking at, would they break down the walls of the cells and just see it as one part of a larger company being the SPC? We think the PIC gets around that because the PIC is a completely separate legal entity. We're certainly of the view, and our US tax colleagues and legal tax advisors are of the same view, that if it was ever challenged in court, it's got a much better chance of that passing muster. So that we are looking to make separate elections within one group structure. You might have a series of PICs in a structure like the one that we're dealing with at the moment. They might want to make different tax elections. A PIC will allow you to do that. An SPC structure with just individual cells is a bit questionable.
Do you have the option, I don't know, not an accountant, do you have the option then not to consolidate the financials of the PIC into the core and then into the parent?
I'm not an accountant either, but I've anecdotally, we've had these conversations before. I think you consolidate up. So the PIC has got to have its own separate accounts and its own separate audit. And there's always a debate as to whether it should be consolidated up to the controlling voting shares, or whether you take into account the actual economic interest of the participating shares that are usually sort of below that. I'm not sure what the final decision has been, to be honest. I don't know if we have any of our audit or accounting friends in the room. Fortunately not. So I'm not sure how it's dealt with ultimately from an accounting perspective. Save to say that it has to have its own separate audit.
From an IRS perspective, each filing tax code.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, unlike a cell, you've got a separate program down in a PIC, but it can have its own board. So often you'll see participants in a structure like this being unrelated to the owners of the actual SPC up at the top. And one of the major benefits of having a PIC is that they can have their own board, they can have representation and control of that board, and make their own decisions in their own insurance program. Subject, of course, to an ultimate silver bullet, if you like, where the SPC can actually take over that board in circumstances where the PIC goes rogue. But in sort of normal daily operations, the board might consist of a majority of participant nominees, and in terms of running the normal insurance program, they would be unfettered in terms of how they would do that.
Are those spelled out like a participation agreement?
Absolutely, and we're going to get to some examples of that shortly. PIC's also easier for a counterparty to understand. If you're looking at getting a banking relationship or a contractual arrangement with anybody else onshore, a PIC is just like another company. It's like a standalone legal entity all by itself. Whereas sometimes counterparties aren't going to understand, a cell in an SPC structure quite as well. So that's just another example.
Rob, any drawbacks to a PIC?
Yeah, and we're going to get to them in just a second. Not many, but a few. Just to touch on a few more of the sort of the real advantages. A PIC can also transition to a standalone captive, and that's an advantage in this situation, or might be an advantage in due course. An SP, a cell in an SPC structure, is not its own legal entity. It can't, if it does particularly well, and the program that's being housed in that cell can now get to a point where it can justify being its own captive, it can't spin off easily. You'd have to set up something new, try and do a loss portfolio transfer, innovation, whatever it may be. A PIC has the ability as a separate legal entity to spin off completely and stand alone as a new independent entity, which is an appealing situation to, for participants and in an insurance program who want to look for economies of scale of being part of a structure like an SPC with multiple programs being run out of it initially, and have the cost savings and economies of scale that go along with it. But once their program grows to a sufficiently large level, they can do it themselves and want the option to do so. A PIC can also merge. So a cell of an SPC, or even an SPC itself, can't merge with another cell or another SPC. We look at the mergers that have taken place in the healthcare sector. If you've got two hospital groups in the US with SPC structures set up in the Cayman Islands, it's difficult for those two to merge. And ordinarily, that's exactly what you would expect and what you would want if there's a merger of the parents over in the US. A PIC gets around that. Again, it's a separate legal entity, so a PIC could merge with another standalone captive, which might belong to another hospital group if that was a scenario. So that's another significant advantage. And a PIC can also redomesticate. If you need to make a jurisdictional change for some reason, there's no reason why you can't take your PIC and redomicile or continue it out back to the US, to wherever else you need to go. We hope that would never happen, but it's an option and important flexibility to have, I think. Some disadvantages very quickly. So unlike just having a normal cell in an SPC structure, a PIC does involve a registration process. It's relatively simple, so it's a basic registration process with SEMA. There are a few additional costs. They're not great costs. So the PIC company formation is usually about $2,600, and there are SEMA fees of about $1,200 to set up, and annual fees of about $300, which are relatively small in the great scheme of things, but you wouldn't be paying them if you just had an SPC structure. Another advantage of PIC, the regulatory capital requirement is typically the same as a simple cell. So you'd often see one. A PIC will have its own regulatory capital requirement, whereas a cell only needs to be dollar solvent. So the disadvantage of the PIC is you might have to put $100,000 as a minimum amount into your PIC, whereas if you just had a simple cell, it could be $1 solvent with all the regulatory capital sitting in the core of the SPC itself. So those are some of the advantages and disadvantages. I'm going to skip ahead. Now that we sort of conceptually got it, let's look at what Maple Leaf has actually done with theirs. So this is what, once converted and once the PIC has been formed underneath, this is what the Maple Leaf SPC structure actually looks like. So if you look at the top in the green, we've got Maple Leaf Insurance SPC. And underneath that, we've got the core program. And that's where the first insurance program is actually housed. So the Symphony insurance program, which is the original insurance program, because of the conversion to the SPC, is still housed in the core of the SPC. Underneath that, in yellow, we've got the first segregated portfolio, and that was created for the only purpose of holding those ordinary voting shares as required by the regulations in the newly created Centurion PIC, which is in blue underneath that. And Centurion PIC houses the second insurance program for the other healthcare facilities. Now, if you compare this to the diagram that we had early on, you'll see that we're lacking the participant involvement or the insured's involvement underneath the PIC. And that's one of the interesting distinctions between what we normally expect to see and the maple leaf situations we see here today. You would normally expect the underlying insured participant in the PIC program to want to have economic participation in it and to be able to participate in those underwriting profits and investment profits. This is a slightly different arrangement between the parties. And the primary focus and the primary goal of the participant in the PIC, in this case, is the risk management benefits of being part of the greater program and the economies of scale that they can take advantage of with shared service providers, whether it's lawyers, accountants, auditors, claims administrators, and so on and so forth. Now, because we don't now have to have that equity participation in the underlying PIC, we've decided not to issue shares. Instead, we're going to have the underlying insured participate in the program contractually. And that takes us to the various legal agreements that we've put in place to govern the relationships between the parties in this particular legal structure.
And, Rob, just for the benefit of time, why don't we run through them quickly just to give the audience a brief overview, and then, perhaps if there's time at the end, we'll be able to go into some of them in more detail.
Thanks. I'll do that. So, very briefly, one of the main documents you always want to look at is your PIC memorandum and articles of association. So those are the bylaws of the company, which set out all the usual capitalization requirements, board meetings, shareholders meetings, and so on and so forth. But more interestingly, in this particular situation, we're interested in how the relationship is managed between the various parties contractually. And there are two main agreements there. The first is the business services agreement. And really, the purpose of the business services agreement, it's an agreement between the PIC and the core of the SPC itself, I should say the SPC itself. And its purpose is to address two features. First of all, a participation fee, which is paid by the PIC up to the SPC, and that's for setting up and helping with the initial capitalization of the PIC in the first place, and also the various sort of administrative services that are offered by the SPC for and on behalf of the PIC, or I should say for the benefit of the PIC, and that's negotiating with service providers and so on and so forth. So that's a business services agreement that would be put in place. Now, the program services agreement is entered into between the PIC, the SPC, and the underlying insured or participant themselves. All the provisions contained in the program services agreement would usually be contained in a shareholders agreement if we had equity participation. In this case, it's contractual participation, and that agreement will address things like the fact that the PIC must only write the insurance program exclusively for the participant insured underneath it. So the participant doesn't want the PIC writing other insurance programs for other third parties without its written consent. It also provides that the insured, who is not an equity owner, has to provide additional funding to the PIC if need be, whether for collateral requirements or for regulatory capital requirements. So again, the SPC is not obliged to provide that funding if necessary. The actual underlying insured or participant has to do it on a contractual basis. And then, of course, most interestingly, the agreement deals with the control and the composition of the PIC board itself. So we know we've got a board up at SPC level, but we also have a board down at PIC level. And as we mentioned, one of the flexibilities and advantages of a PIC is that an underlying participant can have control or at least representation on the board. And typically what we've seen in the past is that a participant will want to appoint all of the directors to the board. They'd like to have as much control as they possibly could. But the overlying SPC will always want a silver bullet, if you like, and will always want to know what the PIC board is doing. And for that reason, we usually see the overlying SPC able to appoint at least one director to the board. Now, in this case, it's slightly different. We've got the parties are comfortable with each other, and because there's not an equity participation by the underlying participant insured, the majority of the PIC board in these circumstances actually consist of nominees of the SPC itself, with the underlying participant able to appoint up to 50% of that board. And I think that's the situation we've got at the moment. It's about a 50-50 scenario. So that's how the contractual arrangements have worked and been put in place. And in due course, if more, further programs are added to the structure, we may look at moving the program down from the core into another underlying PIC, and then adding new segregated portfolios with new PICs underneath that, and that may well give rise to amendments to the various agreements that we've got in place.
Right, and so this is the opportunity to present it itself. So ostensibly, you had Symphony with its now single-parent captive converting into an SPC. You have a competitor of theirs reaching out to them and saying, hey, we need help with our own captive platform. Can you help us? And the answer was, absolutely. We're going to form a PIC for you, and we're going to charge you for it. In order to make certain whether that's feasible or not, and again, that's a relationship that works both ways, right? So it's not necessarily SPC taking advantage of the PIC, but they needed a service, they had the opportunity to provide it, and it's something that could be replicated in any industry, really across the board. Taking a look at one of your competitors, and if you have this model available, saying, hey, let's see if we can work together in the sandbox with regards to this issue. In order for this to make sense, though, the numbers have to make sense. So, Jeremy, how do the numbers make sense?
So, full disclosure, I had nothing to do with this actuarial wizardry slide. This is Ari's creation. As an actuary, I'm not cool enough to understand what hashtags mean and how you use them. And actually, this is the second time in 2 days that I've been referred to as a wizard, as some of you here can attest to. So since the cat's out of the bag,
Oh, no.
hang on.
Oh, no.
Hang on. Again, I actually bought this wand. I'm going to cast a spell over you. You're going to find these actuarial slides exceptionally interesting. Here you go. All right, so 3 themes today that I want
Where
you to
did
take
he
away.
find that in a
My
day? I don't know.
second magic act is going to be to get you guys out on time, because I know we're standing between you and drinks and the rest of your evening. So 3 things I want you to take away from today. One is that if you're considering using a captive program, make sure that you have a team of advisors that understands the goals and objectives of your captive, okay, and your particular insured. Too far away, thank you, Bob. Because as you'll see here, the way that we've structured the program definitely responds to the unique needs and objectives of this particular set of insureds. The second is that you're going to see that captives are enormously flexible. And I think that's one of the main strategic advantages that they have over commercial insurers. You can really craft an insurance program, a captive insurance program, to meet whatever your needs are. So rather than trying to fit you into their box, we're trying to fit a box around the client and their particular needs and make sure that we're meeting those. The third thing is make sure that you have a team of advisors that has demonstrated the expertise to deliver on the goals and objectives. As we go through some of this is complicated. And so you need to make sure that you've got a team that understands and is also creative. And creative is not necessarily a word that you typically associate with an actuary, but hopefully you'll see a little bit of creativity as we go through this. So this first slide, what I really want you to take away is just you have to understand, again, the goals and objectives of your clients, and they vary. Now, I'm a healthcare guy, and so predominantly all I do is healthcare. But even within healthcare, there's a lot of different varying goals and objectives for clients. One of those lines of delineation oftentimes is for-profit versus not-for-profit. The needs and goals and objectives are pretty different. Some of these are going to be obvious to you. Tax strategy, very different, so you got to make sure when you're dealing with for-profit companies that you really understand what their tax strategy is, and you structure the program in a way to deliver on that. Some of these other things I've observed about, for-profit, the funds for initial capitalization, as you've heard, some already mentioned today, are oftentimes scarce, and sometimes they come in different forms, LOCs instead of cash. And so as an actuary, when you have a captive owner that wants to fund with very low capital, it makes it a little more challenging. The fourth bullet down, going hand in hand with that low capitalization, the insureds in this case didn't want to fund the premiums at a higher confidence level. They wanted to keep the funding levels, initial capitalization and the funding levels also pretty low. So you can see, there were some challenges and that really required us to be creative in how we structured it. The last bullet point, I'll just say, this is a healthcare example, but the flexibility of a captive, crosses across all industries. So, so while the example here today is healthcare, it cuts across. Tax considerations, even for an actuary, I get kind of bored. Tom, no offense, right? When we start going into taxes, so I'm going to be brief here. just that you need to make sure that you have somebody that understands the tax strategy. It's a really important thing for for-profit companies. There's 3 basic tenets. You can see there, there's risk transfer, risk distribution, risk sharing. I gave you some examples of how Maple Leaf particularly are meeting those requirements. Those are what the IRS look for in determining whether this is truly insurance or not. And that's a really important determination for them to come to, again, because of the insureds back home want to be able to deduct those premiums for tax purposes, and then the insurance company, the captive, wants to be able to take a tax deduction for the loss reserves. Going to elaborate a bit more on risk transfer because that was something that, in particular, Maple Leaf was struggling with. So risk transfer, quite simply, is just that the insurance contract, the insurance policy, has to transfer or create the risk of financial loss for the insurer. And so in a very simple example there, if you're writing a policy with a $10 million aggregate and you're charging $10 million for it, there's no risk of loss for the insurance company. And so the IRS is going to come in and look at that and say, that's not insurance. You've just lost your tax deductibility of premiums, and you've also lost the tax deductibility of loss reserves. So not only do they have to show risk transfer, but oftentimes we get questions, well, how much risk transfer does it have to be? And so a general rule of thumb that you'll oftentimes hear is that the insurance company has to have at least a 10% chance of a 10% loss. So if you're writing $10 million of premium, there has to be at least a 10% chance that insurance company is going to lose $1 million. And there's other ways that you can show risk transfer. That's just a rule of thumb. There's other things that the IRS would sign off on, but again, that's just a rule of thumb. In a particular example of risk transfer for Maple Leaf, again, we're writing a $3 million aggregate in 2015. The IRS wants you to take into account the time value of money using a risk-free rate. And so when you kind of figure out when those claims are going to be paid, $3 million worth of claims, the present value of that is $2.78 million. We can't charge a $2.78 million premium because, again, we have to be able to show a 10% loss. So if you take 10% off of that, the most we could charge is $2.5 million. The issue that we were running into with Maple Leaf when I first got involved is that the aggregate limit was being set so low that the $3 million was constantly being exceeded. And you can see in order to show risk transfer, the problem we were running into is we basically were pricing to a loss and locking in a loss. And those losses were starting to mount and accumulate. And so it was something that we had to find a solution to. So the challenge, again, real simply, is initially, the aggregate limits were set close to expected loss levels. So it was really hard for us to balance risk transfer while not creating a loss for the captive. Some of you might say, okay, well, just increase the aggregate so you can charge some more. But that was a problem too. Low capitalization levels, low funding levels, right? If you increase the aggregate, you're increasing the exposure to the captive. And that's our job to make sure the captive is financially solvent. And so not necessarily a great option. From an insured perspective, they weren't really enamored with the idea of increasing the aggregate limit because they subscribe to that school of thought that, the more limit you carry, the bigger the target on your back. And so that wasn't necessarily a panacea. We've touched on the relatively low capitalization levels. I'll just say that that makes the issue of pricing accuracy and limiting the financial exposure, that much more acute. We don't have a lot of margin for error because we're not carrying a lot of capital. And then again, the reluctance to fund more conservatively. The insureds have a business that they're running back home. In Illinois, as Peggy alluded to, is a challenging environment, particularly for long-term care. And so we didn't have the luxury of charging them more, and we needed to make sure to balance their cost needs. So the solution that we came up with was to set an initial aggregate very close or actually even below the expected loss level. And we utilized what we call aggregate reinstatements so that as that initial aggregate is used up, automatically additional reinstatements of that aggregate limit would be triggered. And so that was a way for us to kind of make sure that we were just giving enough coverage to the insured and limiting the financial exposure, but also giving a mechanism for us to charge additional premiums if the losses increased so that we could keep the captive financially whole. One of the other benefits of having that initial low ag that has been really appealing to some of the participants of the program is there's a lower premium. If you're issuing a smaller ag up front, you can charge a lower premium for it, and so again that allows them to hang on to cash longer. And then from a defense attorney perspective, Peggy will tell you that when you have lower aggregate limits, sometimes the plaintiff attorneys will settle for pennies on the dollar. When they know that aggregate limit's about to run out, all of a sudden they're willing to agree to things that they may not have been otherwise. So that was also something that's been pretty critical to the program. Okay, last slide, believe it or not. Go ahead, Bob.
So are you able to hide the fact that you have these reinstatement aggregates when the attorneys ask to see your insurance?
We do not hide it.
We don't hide anything.
Don't like that word. However, I will not answer interrogatories, so if they have a question, I give them the policy. I'm not going to educate them on the insurance. If they choose to hire an outside counsel, which a plaintiff's attorney would have to do to understand the program, we've never seen them do it. If we're forced in that situation to give a policy, this aggregate reinstatement's an endorsement on the policy. No one has ever caught it.
And to add to that, not only is the policy structured this way, but the insurance certificates are as well. So we break up our coverage into primary and excess. So our certs show a 250 with a 750 excess, 750 with a 2.25,
Yeah.
or 2.75 on top of that, such that the frequent flyers know how to read the cert, but the one-off guys are, they see the cert, they read it like an auto cert, and they think you've got 250 in coverage.
Yes, so it is included in the policy. Like I said, I try not to answer and explain the policy to anyone. I will absolutely give them a copy, and if they choose to read the whole thing and figure out what the aggregate reinstatement. Yes.
So real quick, this fulfills my obligation as an actuary to put up a complicated and confusing graph. So thank you. Hopefully the spell worked and you're finding it interesting. On the y-axis, quite simply, the underwriting profit and loss that the captive is making. On the x-axis, just what the claim amounts are, the total amount of claims. One of the things you'll see, we show this to every one of our insureds. So we're very transparent about how we're pricing things and where we're making money and where we're not, because ultimately this is a partnership with them, and so we want to be transparent. You can see, again, a $2 million initial aggregate for a premium of 1.75. You might say, okay, well, you know that that's going to be blown because your expected loss pick is $2.75 million, so haven't you just locked in a $250,000 loss? No, because we've structured aggregate reinstatements that trigger at 1.7. So before we get into a loss position, an aggregate reinstatement triggers, we charge additional premium, which is why you can see the profit jump up when that happens. And it's a mechanism for us to kind of keep the captive bouncing around in a reasonably profitable level, but a modest profit, so that again, that we're not, making too much profit on the back of our insureds.
And we do utilize Jeremy's graph when we're looking at claim settlements as we're starting to get closer to see where we're going to hit on the X and Y axis as we're trying to look at the policy years.
I'm done.
We're done. So with that being said, there's been a lot of information. Certainly any of us are available for questions after this presentation or at any point over the course of the conference. I want to thank you very much for attending. I do see some hands that are starting to jump up, but I know that there's going to be an announcement about the buses to the Kimpton, which we all apparently must catch this year. So thank you very much for your attendance today, and enjoy the rest of the week.